Now, let's imagine for a moment that a Christian university, let's say in rural Texas, has a lab that's doing research on viruses as part of their work on future vaccines. Now, the work involves making the viruses they're studying more pathogenic. Then a novel coronavirus appears in that same town as the university lab and then ends up killing some people, and then it starts spreading around the world. The scientists at the university insist that their work had nothing to do with this new coronavirus. They also refuse to cooperate with any health agency other than those controlled by the state of Texas. The Republican governor of Texas, in this hypothetical, is backing the university. Now, how would the regime press cover that story? And do you think the Biden administration would be demanding answers, issuing condemnations of these risky practices, and citing the crushing loss of life and gargantuan economic consequences caused by this irresponsible university? Well, of course it would. And of course the left would just assume that the lab leak was purposeful at that university. Yeah, let's get back to real life. Biden's team lets China off the hook completely for what it did in Wuhan, for the ensuing cover-up, and for the cataclysmic harm it inflicted on our country. Now, going back to February 2020, before the pandemic was even declared, I knew something was up when I asked Anthony Fauci directly about China's response to the outbreak.
The Chinese authorities have really been very explicit that they were going to not tolerate any misinformation.
I'm surprised that you would say that, given what we know about China's pattern of lying about critical issues, Dr. Fauci.
The Chinese scientists I've dealt with myself personally for years, if not decades. Many of them have trained here in the United States. I have faith that they are not distorting things.
So revealing. Now, fast forward to this week at the UN. Despite all the challenges with trade, human rights, and the virus, both Biden and Harris went out of their way not to single out China. But if we don't hold China accountable, how the heck can we prevent this from happening again and again and again? But don't worry, because our vice president wants to throw money at some global health slush fund of some $1 billion total.
To avoid the mistakes of the past and meet this present moment, we must also ensure transparency and accountability to ensure that all countries meet our global health obligations. A Global Health Threats Council that would monitor progress and identify gaps.
Identify gaps? If China is lying and hiding facts, we won't even know where to look. Now, the press is more obsessed with covering a riot where one unarmed protester was killed than a pandemic that killed more than 675,000 Americans. The fact is, China is howling at us. They're laughing. They got away with global death and destruction, and America's response is the equivalent of, "Thank you, sir, may I have another?" The order of how things went down with Biden and China goes something like this. Now, early on in the administration, Team Biden thought that Europe would help us put pressure on China to change its ways. But of course, with Trump gone, Europe is cutting its own deals with China and stiff-armed us, basically. Then Blinken was embarrassed by China in Alaska. So we now have John Kerry essentially running our China policy. That fact should terrify every living American. The man has been underestimating and mishandling our relationship with China for decades.
Our nations have worked together to bring about important progress on a range of global issues, including a landmark agreement on climate change in Paris last year. We also worked very closely together on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on Iran's nuclear program.
There is no U.S. strategy to try to push back against or be in conflict with China.
Now, remember when Kerry visited China earlier this month? Senior officials in China wouldn't even dignify him with a meeting in person, only over Zoom. He went all the way over there. They sent a junior level staffer to deliver their demands to Kerry. How insulting. Well, he took that lesson to heart and returned from that utterly embarrassing trip at an even bigger as an even bigger CCP apologist than he was before.
There are other things as well, such as the Uyghur situation in the West. What is the process by which one trades off climate against human rights?
Well, life is always full of tough choices in the relationship between nations.
Now, the choice of standing up for human rights is perhaps tough for Kerry because of the incredible financial leverage the CCP has over his family. Just yesterday, we learned that John Kerry's wife, Teresa Heinz, is heavily invested in China through her family trusts. Government ethics disclosures reveal Kerry's wife has over $1 million interest in a New York-based investment firm that is run by a Chinese citizen and has major holdings in Chinese companies. Now, how doesn't this add up to someone being at least having an appearance of a conflict of interest, if not an actual one? But the Biden administration just doesn't care here. Conflicts of interest, corruption, they're just part and parcel of the Biden family tradition. And Kerry's family has played a supportive role all along. Back in 2009, Kerry's stepson, Christopher Heinz, teamed up with none other than Hunter Biden to found a private equity firm that went on to enter lucrative partnerships with CCP-owned companies. And they also cut a multi-million-dollar deal with the Chinese oil giant CFEC. Now, Heinz's attorney swears he played no role in any of these ventures. Okay, but we know the Biden family absolutely did. And I'm not just talking about Hunter. I want to remind you, and think about this May 2017 email that was recovered from Hunter's laptop by the New York Post last year. In the message, one of Hunter's partners mentions setting aside a chunk of equity in their China deal for the, quote, big guy. Well, it's obvious who that was.
On May 13, 2017, I received an email concerning allocation of equity, which says 10% held by H for the big guy. In that email, there's no question that H stands for Hunter, big guy for his father, Joe Biden.
The financial entanglements between the Biden administration and the CCP are real, and they're frightening. And they cast some of the more inexplicable decisions that our government has recently made in a new and perhaps more understandable light. Now, consider the shocking news that the Secret Service and FBI just purchased surveillance drones from a Chinese company that the Pentagon itself had just singled out as a potential security risk. How the heck was that allowed to happen? If Biden really wants to save our global position and save Taiwan, boost our manufacturers, put China back on its heels, at this point, he has a simple to-do list. If he wants to do any of that, number one, he should just leave all of Trump's trade policies in place. They worked. Number two, stop relying on Europe. Focus on the China threat, with or without them. And number three, fire John Kerry. Well, is Biden going to do any of this? Probably not. I'm not holding my breath. President Xi is treating us like, at this point, just a plaything. It's almost pathetic it's so easy to play the United States. He knows that with Biden and Kerry at the helm, well, he's got this in the bag because Sleepy Joe is already bought and paid for. And that's the angle.